So I guess the first question is, how did you first learn of this story?
Yeah, this is one of those stories about, do you discover a story or does a story come to you? And I've made one other film before this called Aram Aram, and it was a small coming of age story set here in Los Angeles, but it luckily was able to reach people across America, Canada, and
Mhm.
Australia. And after I finished presenting the film in Australia, I was reading an article on my way back about a case, an extraordinary case involving a human rights violator discovered in America. And I started, clicking and copying and pasting on Google and being like,
Mhm.
oh, I want to learn more about this. And it's a story about 3 Ethiopian women. And as I read more and more about this story, my jaw just dropped.
Yeah.
And I said, this is the most incredible story I've never heard. um,
Mhm.
and so I was just gripped by it, and I kind of made a little folder on my computer, and I just couldn't stop thinking about it. And honestly, I was thinking, well, this is not a story that I could tell. This has to do with women who are from Ethiopia. Their background is so different, their culture is so different from mine. Who am I to tell this story? But honestly, it wouldn't let go of me. So in 2017, late 2016, I said, you know what? Why don't I try to connect with these women and see if they'd be interested in making a documentary so that more people will know about their
Mhm.
journey. And that began this very long process of becoming friends with them, building trust with them, and bringing them into the process of making the film to make sure that I didn't tell their story in the wrong way, to make sure I served their story correctly. And that was really the genesis. It was just an article I read while traveling.
Yeah, it is an extraordinary story, and the way you begin with Edge just being at work one day, and all of a sudden she just recognizes this voice from one of her coworkers, and lo and behold, it's someone who performed these atrocities against her and these other women. I just can't imagine. I can't imagine what I mean. We get a really good idea of what the thought process that's going through their heads as the film unfolds. I just can't imagine what that type of scenario is like for somebody.
Yeah, it's one of those things that's it's so dark, but it's also so interesting because something I've never been interrogated, I've never been tortured, but it's interesting that she recognized him because of his voice, which
Hmm.
is such a true and telling detail. Because obviously, if you think about it, and I obviously have no way of knowing what it's like for her, but she wasn't staring her interrogator in the face, but she was listening to his voice for
Hmm.
hours and hours and hours
Yeah.
as this was going on. And she told me as well, and it's in the documentary a little bit, that she honestly thought she had lost her mind
Hmm.
because the coincidence is so unbelievable,
Yeah.
so unlikely, that she thought, I must be like, I just cracked, like that's it. And then when she verified that he had that, this employee's, her coworker's name was the same as the man who was in charge of interrogation and torture, she
Hmm.
realized this has really happened.
Yeah. And when it came to putting the film together and deciding how you were going to tell this story, what were some of the bigger challenges you had in the way you decided to tell this story?
Yeah, so this story is told through a combination of interviews with the women and all the lawyers involved. Then there's a bunch of archival material, which is hard to find because this
Mm-hmm.
is archival material from the revolution and the period that followed, called the Red Terror in 1970s Ethiopia. And then we shot recreations, so
Mm-hmm.
cinematic sequences. And all of those were very complicated. One, interviews are complicated because it's extremely sensitive material that we're talking about. So it takes a lot of care and respect, and mutual respect and trust. And then for the archival material, I went to Ethiopia and I spent a month there. And every morning I was there for a few hours with our Ethiopian producer, Hermes Wolde Amlak, in the Ethiopian Broadcast Company's archives, going through videotapes. And that's interesting because it's very different than in America. There, it's the state-owned media channel.
Yeah.
So it's a very different experience, a different feeling than going to like ABC or CBS or Fox here,
Mm-hmm.
which is like corporate. So that was a very different experience, and we got to go through all this extraordinary footage that they had in their archives, old tapes. And then the recreations were something we didn't originally think we were going to tell the story this way. But when we realized that there was no footage of the trial, and as one of the women says in the documentary, she said, when somebody tortures you, they don't take pictures, they don't take a video.
Right.
So we said, for me, I'm trying to share the story of these three women's journey through what happened to them. Mm-hmm. So we thought the way to best capture that was to then do these recreations, but to make sure that the women participated and got to see the editing, got to see the cuts, got to tell me, no, you're going the wrong way with that. That's not how it felt. That's not what I meant. And then they could correct us so that we were representing their experience rather than me making up some false experience.
Okay, yeah, that was my next question about the recreations, because of the fact that is such a tricky proposition to do in documentaries, because if you don't do it right, you're either being disrespectful to the actual events that happened, or it's just going to be so laughably bad that you have a hard time taking the rest of the film seriously. And hearing that the women were basically in charge, or basically helping you through that process of recreating that makes it make sense just how resonant those sequences actually get, because of the fact that we're able to really, and the courtroom scene, I think the courtroom scene in particular could have been really difficult to sort of take seriously, because it's kind of hard not to draw on like the cliches of courtroom dramas that we're used to. But having the women tell their experiences over that footage, and just having the footage be silent, essentially, I think that was one of the strongest aspects of the movie from a filmmaking standpoint. And I think it really helped add weight to those sequences considerably.
Well, that's a really interesting insight you have into that scene. And it's almost like you saw an insight into our process of making it. So, when we get to the point in the film where we find out what happened to the women, that scene originally was cut with temp music. Mm-hmm. And what I realized, I said, this is not the right way to tell this part of the story. That was before I even showed it to the women. And I said, no, like that's making it melodramatic, and this is real suffering. Mm-hmm. This is real trauma. And so that's really interesting. You picked up on that. That's really fascinating, because we didn't know how people would react to that subtlety of changing what you're hearing.
Yeah. And it's were there any, when it came to getting to know the women, you said this was a years long process. I mean, you basically started in 2017, you said. How difficult was it for them to be interviewed about this really painful time in their lives?
Well, so you're right. It was a very long process. It started in 2017. 2016 is when I read the article. 2017 is when I said, maybe I'll try. Let me try and connect with these people that were involved and see if they'd be interested in telling the story in a film. And basically, there were many, many, many hours where we would spend talking beforehand. So both on over Skype at the time, there was less Zoom, and also in person. Mm-hmm. So I would go and actually met with them, and we didn't talk about the film. We talked about everything but the film. We didn't talk about their past. We talked about everything but their past. Mm-hmm. We just chatted like people getting to know each other. And that was an opportunity, I realized afterwards, for them to just feel out what kind of person I am, mm-hmm. and was, and whether or not they want to engage in this relationship of making this film with me or not. And that was totally in their court. They're all very, very strong women, very mm-hmm. strong, not just for what they've endured, but for what they've accomplished in their lives after. So they have no problem saying no. Mm-hmm. They will not be pushed around, which I love. I respect them a lot. And then in the interviews itself, I mean, luckily I've done about 100 interviews or so filmed before this for different projects, for hire work or other projects. So I had some feeling of how to work with someone when you're trying to go through their life in a way that makes sense, because life is chaotic in a way that doesn't make sense for a movie. And what I did was to say each day that when we would do an interview, because there were several days we would do interviews, sometimes spaced out by months, sometimes spaced out by a day or 2 days, is that I'd say, okay, here's what I'd like to cover today. And then say, does that sound good to you? So it's not that I'm saying I'm going to ambush you. It's saying I'm going to let you know and be emotionally prepared. And if you're on board as well, then we move forward. Okay. Because I felt like that was the respectful way. So
yeah, was there ever time? How much? Because I mean, we do get for the historical context of what the Red Terror was in Ethiopia. Was there ever challenge of either worrying about putting too much of that in to give the larger picture over the women's experience, or was it pretty clear that you kind of knew that you were going to how much context you wanted to add of that situation, and so we could just focus on what the women were going through?
Again, it's almost like you've been watching our filmmaking process. This is like a really interesting that you have an insight into this. So the original cut of the film was an hour longer, with an hour more history, 1 hour extra history, because we were trying to figure out what do we need to explain to an American audience.
Yeah.
Right. Ethiopian audience will know the history, and our history in America is quite short, and their history is vast, extraordinarily vast and complex. So it became this story like, well, how far back do we need to go into the mythology and the origins of Ethiopia and the country of Ethiopia? Because it's a fascinating history. There's lots of fascinating things. It was never colonized. The only country in Africa besides Liberia that was never colonized. They're occupied by Italy for 5 years, but like an incredible legacy. That alone could be 30 minutes to inform Americans and North Americans about this, or Westerners who don't know the history. So, but that's not what the story's about. So we found one is that we thought, okay, we need to serve the story. So the story isn't the history of Ethiopia. The story is, what do you need to understand? And most people I've met in America and traveling in the West don't know that everybody knows Haile Selassie. A lot of people know it from Rastafari culture. But Haile Selassie was the emperor for decades in Ethiopia. And then in 1974, there was the Ethiopian Revolution. And out of the chaos of that revolution, a military tribunal or military committee took power temporarily to set up elections. And out of that, with many other events happening, a dictator came to power, named Mengistu. And in that, amidst that chaos and that power struggle, arose a period of great violence called the Red Terror, which was a purge of any suspected opposition members in Ethiopia. So that's so our objective was to figure out, how do we balance the story so that it doesn't just appeal to history buffs, but rather we're going on an emotional journey with these women in their what turned out to be historic attempts to bring a torture to justice in Atlanta.
What was the biggest thing that you got out of the experience of making this movie?
Wow. I mean, I have to say, it turned out to be a much more emotional roller coaster than I ever expected personally in my personal life. Going through this journey of creating a relationship with the women, which I've interviewed lots of people, but I've never developed a friendship in that process. It's usually been more just a short, I'm going to come in and interview you, shoot it, and move on. So that is profound, because now they're these women that I respect greatly, that I am also honored to call my friends as well. And then going to Ethiopia, which I'd never been to, for a month there, and we were able to, with Ermias Waldiamnak, our producer there, we were able to find the locations where the women were interrogated and tortured and shoot there, which is sort of an incredible experience, but also emotionally very complicated experience to be in a room where people that you know and you really care about had something really, really horrible happen to them. Is sort of something I've never experienced living here in the States and in my other projects. And then the last thing I'd say is just here in Los Angeles, we could have made this project without the support of the local Ethiopian community and the Little Ethiopia Cultural Center, who helped us to connect with about 50 or 60 members of the Ethiopian community who are actually in our film representing Ethiopian people that in the story and members of the Ethiopian community. And that was really moving because it was multiple generations. It was the next generation, young adults, and it was a generation that themselves had survived atrocities. So that day of filming, for me, I almost broke down crying because I was so struck by the emotional experience of having people from that community come to support the film, to be in it. And I just wasn't prepared for the emotional power of that experience. So it's been a real, I'm very grateful to all the people in the different communities of Ethiopia, from Atlanta to Los Angeles to Canada and Addis Ababa, who came together to be part of this project.
One more question. What do you hope that audiences take away from this film, other than just getting to know these extraordinary women who went through this unbelievably hellish experience?
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating because this project took 40 years to make. So America in 2017 is a different place than America today. I think there's a couple of themes that are important that I hope one of them at least connect with some people. One is the fact that these women are survivors, and they came forward to say, this is what happened to me. And the lawyers that they went to say, this is the human rights lawyers, they went to say, this is what happened to me. Those lawyers believe them. And that's those two steps of them having the courage to bring up the worst that ever happened to them, and then that the survivors were believed. That was the only thing that allowed this case to go forward and to become the historic case it was. And that resonates in a really shocking and powerful way today. And I think the other thing is, part of the style of this film is I hope to be able to connect the story and bring the story to college students as well. So we tried not to make it dry. We tried to make it an emotional journey, because it's only 3 women who came to America and have no power, right? They came as refugees. They barely, they didn't speak English like a native person does. They didn't have money. They didn't have contacts, but they had a will to fight for justice. So they didn't have any of the connections that people generally need in our capitalist society, but they had courage and tenacity, and they made a difference in this world. So I don't want to give away the end of the film, but I hope that people see that, and maybe they connect that if these 3 women can make a difference, maybe when I'm watching this and I'm a college student at home and I'm wondering if I can make a difference in the world, they can see definitely. So that's my hope.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me today. It was just an overwhelming experience, but it's also one that I do think provides some inspiration, not only for what these women were able to do, but what they were able to overcome. And thank you very much for bringing this story to the world through cinema.
Well, again, thank you for taking time. Anybody who takes an hour and a half out of their life to watch this film, I just want to say thank you. And I hope more people get to know about these 3 women who, to me, are American heroes. We need to remember, refugees and immigrants are what make America America. So I just want to say thank you to you. It's an honor to be on your podcast, and I really appreciate it.
Oh, no problem. Thank you. And this is the world premiere of it, right?
Yeah, this is the very first time anyone will be able to see this in the public. So Friday, April 30th at 8:30 p.m. at the Plaza Theater, Atlanta. is the very first time we're doing one night only special event, outdoor
Mhm.
screening. So it's going to be drive-in style.
Yeah.
And I think tickets are already selling pretty quickly. So we'll
Mhm.
see how many are available. But we wanted to make our premiere meaningful because amidst COVID, you see people go to Sundance, Tribeca, wherever,
Yeah.
and you never hear anything because no one's gathering together. There's
Mhm.
no moment. So we said instead, let's try to focus on how can we make this meaningful. I said, well, let's go to the city that supported these women to begin with
Mhm.
and show our appreciation and say, this is the first time anyone can see this in public, and it's going to be in Atlanta, where at least that stage of it all began.
Yeah, and this is actually my third year covering the Atlanta Film Festival, and
Oh,
I can say that based on my previous two experiences, it's like I think this movie is going to connect really well with the audience there. So I wish you luck with the premiere, but I think it's going to be something that resonates really well with that audience.
that's amazing to hear because I have no idea. I'm so inside of it. But also, if people want details on where we're screening and how to see it, they can just hit us up on social media like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We're at A Fire Within Doc, and I'll be
Mhm.
reposting the details. So because there's lots of stuff going on right now, it's a little confusing.
Yeah.
But I really appreciate it. It's really means a lot from my heart to anyone who gives a moment for this story. So
Oh,
thank
no
you.
problem. Thank you very much.